Recording in progress.
Okay, we're going to reconvene this meeting. Okay, first on our agenda, Nina Corson is going to share with us the updates on the Drockman properties and the RFP process. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here. I feel like I'm at the wrong angle. Pleased to be here today. I'm here to kind of follow up on the last presentation that we gave at the regular board meeting. Where we were a couple weeks ago was that the committee that was reviewing the RFQs that had been submitted to develop a land lease project on our Drockman properties. The committee was meeting, reviewing those proposals, reviewing some additional information that we had requested from the proposer. As you've seen, if you looked at the documents, we had exactly one entity submit a proposal for the RFQ. And I am pleased to say that our review committee unanimously agreed that that proposal is qualified to move forward with the RFP process. So what I'm asking you to consider today is to vote to allow the college to continue to move forward in that process. But also, I would like your thoughts on any priorities that you have. As you know, we had a large work group that worked to come up with this idea of a land lease option, and also developed a list of priorities that work group believed would benefit the community and our students here. I want to thank that group again. I would also be interested in knowing if you all have any input into the priorities as we move forward. I will point out that this is a very significant decision for the college. A land lease option is a 20 to 30-year commitment, but at the same time, it's a really positive, I believe, opportunity for the college to generate some long-term income that will help the college be able to better serve our students. So with that said, can I answer any questions? Could you be interested in making a vote for us to move forward?
Madam Chair, so we can start this discussion. I have a recommended motion that I'd like to proceed with. I move that the governing board approve commencing the next step for identifying a developer and suitable development project for the college's Drockman properties. The second phase consists of issuing a request for proposal, RFP, to the qualified developer identified in the first phase. The developer will submit a proposal which, if acceptable to the board, will then serve as the basis for negotiating land lease and development agreements, also subject to approval by the board.
Second.
So discussion, questions for Nina?
So if you requested to know what our priorities are, so do we do that now or do we vote on this? Right now we're going to talk about it. Okay. Yeah. So what are your priorities? Okay, so I'm going to say that my priorities in developing this center would be a healthcare center, a cultural center for Native Americans and Chicanos, and that it serve the students, that there be some form of, I understand that, well, because the whole purpose that we went through this process was so that we would not spend any money, none of the college money. But it's acceptable if we can generate revenue that'll benefit the school and the student. And that would be my priority.
Thank you.
Yeah, I concur actually with those statements as well, especially the idea that came from the committee around the healthcare facility that could be there. That's certainly something that would benefit both our students and especially those that are going through the new health professions programs, as well as the community surrounding that area, which is fairly medically underserved. In addition to just students who are on the downtown campus that might want to seek medical attention right next door, but larger, I'm interested in what the developer would come back with in terms of how do we use what's there, that space, that 4 acres, to maximize revenue that could come back to the college. So while like I said, I agree with those priorities, I'm interested in the economics of it, that we can get to it in the RFP and see what mixture of the ideas that were generated by the group that came together or the ideas that they have in their expertise as a developer could bring the most revenue back to us that we could use to fund other projects for our students.
Thank you.
The operative word would be regenerating the revenues for all, because in regenerating that money or those funds for the community, but more important for the students as well too, but for Pima College, I think it's in a 20 to 30 year investment. But I think we as a board and trying to address the community, we need to do the right thing. But I'm very optimistic on what I hope to see when they come back with the ideas and thoughts of the community, but more important, the ideas that we want to share, and especially with the idea of really looking at a holistic part of what's needed here within the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for all the work that you've done. I know that this has been above and beyond what you already have to do, so we definitely appreciate you leading this charge. And so please share with everybody that you've been working with too how thankful we are to have all the input. I would just like to say this is really exciting, and I'm hopeful. When I think about what I would like to see there, I see the creativity and the just the collaboration that's going to happen on that property, and I'm really hopeful. If housing is what they choose, the board looks forward to hearing about how low-income housing can be part of that, hopefully. And then if it's, obviously if the whole place is going to be developed, also let's keep in mind that maybe we want to, if the police force of Pima College needs to be relocated over there, that will also have a facility that could be, for our police force to keep track of what's going on. And then the last thing is that we would like to follow the timeline. I know that it's, we're already beyond, but if we could keep the same parameters from when we were supposed to have finished this in July, if we could keep those same timelines, not the exact date, but the number of weeks, we'd appreciate that too.
We'll work hard on that. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
I would like to see that we always remember our mission and commitment to our students first, and that there's no financial strain put on the Pima College's budget. Listen and evaluate to all options, and remember we serve the community in Tucson, Arizona, and we celebrate our heritage at every opportunity.
Okay, can I call for a vote? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to our second topic today, the comprehensive planning process. Dr. Nick Richmond.
Chair Rial, members of the board, Chancellor Nassi, colleagues and guests, thank you for giving me opportunity to speak with you all today about the beginning of our 2024-2026 comprehensive planning process. Now, if you give me a second, I will find the slides. IT colleagues, if you can help display these to everybody, that would be wonderful.
Can I get the lab? Hold up on the projector.
Oh, it's there. Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so as it currently stands for the college, our suite of major plans are coming to an end. The specific dates are listed here for the different plans that we have in place, including the most recently approved strategic plan extension, which runs until June of 2026. Now, institutionally, we have seen significant progress through the plans that are in place. A number of those things are highlighted here. In particular, through the Education Master Plan and Facilities Master Plan, I would highlight the establishment of centers of excellence. For those of you who've been with the institution a long time, you will remember how very different we were in some program areas before the construction of those facilities, and the significant benefit that's brought to the institution. So what we need to do in 2024 through 2026 is develop our next suite of major plans. We're making some changes to the process, which I will touch upon briefly, but essentially our goal is to identify the next suite of major priorities for the college. What are the next substantial changes we are going to make for this institution to improve the way we can meet the needs of the community we serve? So we're making adjustments to the planning structure. The details here aren't overly important, but historically we have developed each of these major plans separately in their own silos. This led to multiple plans, multiple priorities, lots of internal confusion about what was really the most important thing we were working towards. And what we're doing now through the new structure is centralizing the planning around the strategic plan, but with highly collaborative processes focused on these different areas. So we do the same planning, but we pull everything together into one coordinated plan. So we have a smaller number of priorities, and it's clearer for us where we need to put our time and effort. We have a leadership team that's been put together, comprised of the senior leadership who are responsible for each of these different plans. Now, I want to be very clear. These individuals are not the ones who will be developing the content of the plans. We will be building a network of planning teams who will be doing the legwork to bring forward the recommendations of what needs to be included in those plans. This is a method that we've used over the last couple of planning cycles at the institution. It follows from the recommendations of the Society of College and University Planning. It's worked very well for us up to now. We'll be doing the same thing again. But because we have so many plans taking shape, we need to make sure we have good coordination across the plans, and that's the purpose of the group that you see listed here. Now, we have a high-level timeline, which is very subject to change because we are yet to have our first leadership team meeting for the planning process. That is, in fact, tomorrow morning, so this may have changed by lunchtime tomorrow. But it kind of gives you a feel for the big picture things that we're looking to do over the course of the process. We have committed to 2 fixed deadlines during the course of this planning process. The first is to bring recommendations around the mission fulfillment framework to the board by June of the current academic year, and to bring the strategic plan to the board by June of the following academic year. The details may change around in the meantime during the planning process as we learn things, as we discover new things we need to build into that planning process. So to give you an overview of 3 priority areas that we have for the current academic year. There will be other things underway as well, but these are the 3 big ones where we're going to be putting a lot of institutional effort and commitment around. And for each of these, I'm going to pause on each one and invite the board's input, so that as we start these planning conversations, we can ensure it's informed by the input of all of you, so we can take that input forward and build it into these conversations with stakeholders. And the specific areas we're looking at: benchmarking, research and analysis, foresight work, and I'll explain a little bit what that is in a moment, and then mission review. So in terms of benchmark research and analysis, during this year, we're going to be looking at this institution from as many different directions as possible. We'll be looking at the education landscape outside the institution as well to learn about trends in higher education and the things that may impact the institution. For example, we know, looking at national completion data and retention data too, that there are colleges that have seen significant increases in completers, retention across diverse populations. We want to look at the latest and greatest data, identify which colleges they are today who are seeing those changes, and call them, talk to them, understand what they are doing, what practices they're using to see if there are things we need to bring to Pima. Of course, we need to do a space analysis, staffing analysis, and also other internal analyses to truly understand who we are today, so we can figure out kind of what we need to do, where we need to go to improve. And as a note, the benchmarking will also include internal benchmarking. There's always a tendency to look outside the college, what are the wonderful things going on at other institutions. But we have very successful programs here at the college that are in specific areas or support particular populations. Are there practices that we can take from one area of the college and build upon them, expand them across other areas, put more resources around them so more students can benefit? And to that end, I'd like to pause here and invite the board's input on whether there are specific topics you would like to ensure are considered during this research and analysis phase of the planning process.
Hi, thank you for calling me for the presentation. My question is, would a part of your analysis, and you're looking at staffing, that includes all levels of staffing?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So one of the things that I would like the group to consider is efficiencies in the staffing levels. And that's it.
Sounds good. Thank you. Are there other comments from the board?
One thing that I would like to know is like, what are the graduation rates? What are the attainment rates for certificates and completion in all of our different programs? I know it's not specific to what you're talking about, but that would help us understand, you know, when you do the internal benchmarking, that would be nice to know. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I guess just, you know, I was glad to see that space and staffing were on the top of that list, because those are sort of on the top of mine. And you know, we've had discussions under the context of the budget for the 2 years that I've been here around those issues. But I don't know that, to be totally honest, I really have like a crystal clear picture of what we seem to get caught up on the space issue initially, on this idea of like, there's all this vacant space, but it's not the space we need to do what we need with it. So I would like to have a better understanding of what space do we need versus what we have, and why what we have isn't adequate to meet whatever it is that we need, so that we hopefully can move beyond that discussion every time we talk about new programs and new space. And then again, around, you know, I've said this multiple times, but just to reiterate around, I mean, I'm still very interested in, based on the way that you all sort of see us trending as a college, you know, what levels of staffing at all levels, and in a nod to what Maria said, do we need to be successful with that going forward? And I'm trying to differentiate that from what do we have, because a lot of the discussions that we have seem to be anchored in, well, we have this, and we're trying to figure out how to like fit a square peg in a round hole. And I'm hoping in this process we can sort of forget what we have in that discussion and say, what do we need? And then figure out what pieces we have and then what pieces are missing. And I think that if we can start with that future state, we want to start with the future state rather than start with the present state, it'll get us to a better outcome in terms of where we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
I just wanted to add what Mr. Taylor mentioned. I think the space capacity, I think we need to bring forth a comprehensive analysis and referencing what we have, and as he mentioned, what can be done to better utilize it as well too, because I believe that some of the reports that there might be some that can be utilized more effectively and efficiently as well too. Mm-hmm. But I think that's should be the norm as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay. All right, so let me move forward to the next topic, and that is the foresight work. Now, as an institution in our previous planning cycle, we shifted to a hybrid planning approach that used very traditional higher ed planning methods, environmental scan, institutional context, very traditional planning techniques in higher ed. And we started embracing methods from the Institute for the Future, which are more futures methods, and a different way of thinking about the future of an organization. They're not specific to higher education, but they are generalizable across a range of different sectors and have been used in education as well as in other fields. So as part of the planning work, and it will be a focus for this year, we're going to be using futures techniques to develop scenarios and forecasts about the future. The goal is not to predict the future, one cannot do that, but to take the signs of things that are developing today, the initiatives, the sense of direction of where the world is going, where education is going, and apply techniques to try and anticipate where those trends will lead us to in the future. And by anticipating a different suite of possibilities of things that may happen down the road, we can better prepare the institution today and identify the strategies we need to follow to be ready for these possible future states. We're also going to be leveraging futures games. There's a variety of them that we've played institutionally in the past, which are a different way of engaging people. These foresight methods are a big time commitment. At minimum, it's a 4-hour work session. You can actually spend a couple of days doing this. Futures games, it takes 20 minutes. You have an hour and a half, play a few rounds of a game, and it's just a different way to generate ideas and a different way to connect with different kinds of audiences who really don't want to commit 4 hours, for example, to a particular session. So we're going to be holding a variety of open sessions during the course of the year. We'll be running them for planning team members as well, but we want to make sure there are opportunities for as many people who want to be involved to be involved. We're starting with 2 open 4-hour future sessions, one in person, one online. They will be open to anybody who's interested in attending. If we get strong interest, we will add additional sessions, depending on the demand that we see. This will also very likely be a topic at the Futures Conference in 2025, one of 2 major topics as it currently looks for that event. And I want to note that for these 4-hour sessions, we're looking to set one up that's specifically for community members. Because while this topic will be discussed at the Futures Conference, as I think most of you had the opportunity to be there, we have about an hour and a half of roundtable conversations. There isn't really time to get in depth into these futures techniques, and we will ensure we have a 4-hour block of time where we can do that and bring in community members. And as mentioned here, the futures game that's proved popular when we've tried it is a game called The Thing from the Future. And we'll be setting up sessions of that in person and online during the course of the year for anyone who wants to drop in and play, be they employees, students, community members. And here I'd like your input on how the board would like to be engaged in those futures activities. We could invite the board members to attend one of the 4-hour sessions, invite you to some of the futures games, and we just would like to hear your input on how you would like to be involved in those activities.
Yeah, definitely invite us. I think that would be, I went to your futures conference, it was amazing, but I don't understand, I've never thought about playing a game, so I would like to see what that's all about too. Thank you.
All right, great. Okay, so as we're scheduling those, if we reach out then through the appropriate channels, invite the board, and then please come along, any of those you'd like to be involved in.
Yeah, Andrea takes care of our calendar, so just send that to her and she'll keep us informed. Thank you.
Okay, will do. All right, great, thank you. All right, so let me move to the last topic I wanted to bring forward for the board this evening. And I should note there will be other opportunities and other times we bring planning to this group. This is obviously a very sizable undertaking, and we will touch base with the board regularly to gather your input and insights. But the other major thing for this year is mission review. This is something we always conduct the year before our planning process. This time it's running in parallel a little bit with some of the early stages of the comprehensive planning work. And we will be reviewing the purpose, vision, mission, and behaviors of the institution. We'll also have a conversation around values. Pima used to have values as part of the framework in the past. In the most recent mission review, we switched values for behaviors. And there needs to be a conversation. Is that the right direction? Do we want to go back to values? How do we think this should look? And this will be obviously a very collaborative process with a focus on gathering input across key stakeholder groups to include students, community, and employees. To that end, we are scheduling a very large number of sessions of different kinds across different sites to ensure there are as many ways as possible for people to engage in this review. So we will be holding open sessions across the major college sites in October and March. This will include an evening session as well to ensure there's an opportunity for working community members who are interested in attending to make sure they can be there. We'll also have an online session in each of those time periods as well for anyone who'd prefer to be there that way. We may also set up internal meetings for through different employee groups to set up sessions for those populations to meet together as well. And we will have dedicated sessions for students in the community to ensure we have broad input. I should note students and community will be welcome at any of the open sessions that we have held, but we want to ensure we have some intentional sessions set up specifically for those stakeholders to ensure their voice is heard loud and clear during the process. And this likely will be the second of the major 2025 Futures Conference topics, so we can use that event as well to gather insights regarding the statements. So the last of the topics that for today, I would like to invite comments from the board. There is, at this point, I don't know if we will change the statements. I don't know if they will all stay the same. This will be based on the input we received during the review process. But I wanted to open this up to comments from the board to see, from your perspective, are there things in these statements that are particularly important to you, that you feel were important to maintain in these statements? Are there any topics that you feel are missing that you would like to ensure are considered as part of the conversations? And so if there are comments from the board, that would be wonderful.
During one of our HLC conferences that we attended this year, they were talking about how they're changing, how they are going to come in to assess us. And one of the things that they kept saying over and over is that your mission and your vision, your purpose, we have to make sure we're doing that, right? And that's going to be like if we pass or not. Mm-hmm. And so somebody brought up mission statements like empower every learner every day for every goal. That's very lofty. I love it. But if they actually took the metrics on there, did we empower every learner every day for every goal? That might be hard to prove that we're doing that. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to keep in mind whatever's happening at HLC, that we need to make sure that the words that we choose and our values that we want to put up there are in alignment with what we can reasonably expect us to do for our accreditation process. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
I think we'd be very naive to move forward this process excluding a look at the political structure of Arizona. We all know that the funding that we used to receive from the state legislature has caused significant issues, increases in tuition, property taxes, a number of other things. And I think November is going to be a big election. And I would think that after we see how that has shaken out, that we would have something in our minds about what we can do or say that would get whoever is in power on our side to deliver that funding back to us. And that would be including a conversation with the Maricopa colleges and other kinds of organizations. But I think we'd be very naive to exclude the politicians that control our purse strings and therefore our destiny without having them involved in this conversation.
That's an excellent point. Thank you.
I guess, there's nothing in here that I don't like. So there's nothing in here that I would say, well, we shouldn't do that anymore. Although I appreciate, the comments that were said. But if there were pieces of this that were important to me, even though it is lofty, and I agree with what Teresa said, I do like the inclusiveness of the every learner, every part of it, because we really are trying to reach into some of the most underserved and economically disadvantaged parts of this community and offer them paths forward. And so if I were to underline something, could be like economic growth in the vision, because, and I've talked about this before, when we go to some of these national conferences, and like when we were in DC early this year and the folks from the federal government come, there's just so much emphasis in what they're sharing about from a public policy perspective, from a moving us forward as a country perspective, how much they're leaning on community colleges to be workforce development, drivers of economic growth, all of that. And so, I mean, I'm glad it's in there. I'm not saying we need to change anything, but if you're asking what some pieces of this that were particularly important, I think that one very much is.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to add that the reason that that mission statement came out was primarily because back in the Flores days, they closed enrollment. You had to test or whatever to get in. And so we've come from being an open college to a college that was like holding people back or not allowing entrance. And in my view, you know, the mission statement tells me that it's everybody is open. Our college offers GED, work skills training, transfer programs, and certifications. And now we're doing short-term certifications, which anyway, in my view, everything that they learn, anything that they learn is better than nothing.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank the board. And I just wanted to reiterate, this is really, as you've extended the strategic plan, as it's coming to an end here, this is really an exciting opportunity for the college to think carefully about ourselves, right? It gives us time to reflect on our own outcomes, areas for improvement, to look around the landscape, you know, what's happening now in Arizona, across the country, and think about what that means for us. And then the futures work is really exciting. I think it's a real point of differentiation for us potentially as a college. What is the future of Tucson like? What is the future of Pima County, Arizona? And what is our role in that? And then, of course, how does that manifest itself in our mission? So some really exciting work to come in the next year and a half. And so thank you, Dr. Richmond, for leading this effort. It's going to be a lot of good things to come out of it.
So with that, thank you, Chancellor, and thank you, board members. That's the final of the topics I wanted to gather your input on for this evening. I will be back periodically during the planning process, and of course, if you have comments and feedback along the way, please route those forward through the Chancellor, and we will incorporate those into the planning too. So thank you.
Thank you. And then our last topic today is the fiscal year 2026 budget forecast. Dr. David B.
Good evening, Chairperson Rial, members of the board, Chancellor Nassi, colleagues, guests. I'm pleased to kick off the budget process really early this year. What we're hoping to do is have a lot of good conversations, talk through the key issues, the key opportunities, the key challenges with the board throughout the budget, throughout the year, to make sure that we develop the budget in the best way possible. I have a handful of things to sort of walk you through today. Want to make sure that we leave time for you, because one of the key things I'm trying to get at with the slides today is, what do you want us to provide more information about? So I'm going to open the door for you. I'll walk you through. There are a couple of things where I'm going to say, here's a good door for us to walk through at an upcoming study session. So this is by no means the end-all be-all meeting. This is the kickoff. Let's sort of set the foundation and then work from there. So as Nick just talked about, one of the key things is that the planning process feeds into the budget, right? And the idea here is that we need to ensure that we're meeting the mission of the institution. We need to make sure that we're balancing and managing the goals and the priorities of the institution along with the available resources. So that's the challenge, right? The balance is with do as much as you can with the available resources we have. And as you just were talking about, Dr. McLean mentioned legislative challenges, the funding challenges that come out of the state. So we'll talk a little bit about that, what the outlook, we're going to talk about what the projections are. And then what some of the opportunities are for how to approach those things with the budget and with some of the direction we've had in the past. focusing on some of the things that we've done in the past, obviously finishing up the centers of excellence, building those buildings, getting them staffed, getting them operationally up and running, has been one of the key strategic priorities of the institution the last number of years. Another one is the class comp structure, which creates an ongoing assurance that we're appropriately paying the folks at the college for the work they provide for us. Because of budget cuts and budget challenges over the years, things had stagnated, and there was a major effort to improve the structure through the class comp structure a number of years ago, and then that creates an ongoing burden and challenge for us. Along with that, though, we also have to look at, in each given year, what are the financial performance realities? What things came up in the course of the last year, the last couple of years? What changes have happened, because those affect what the ongoing performance is going to be like. So COVID had major implications on the institution in terms of reduced enrollments and some of the implications related to that. And then the trickle-on effects of the fact that our staffing stayed high at the levels it was in the pre-COVID era, but the enrollments are significantly lower. So those are the kinds of things that, okay, some of the performance metrics that we look like are out of whack, mostly because enrollment has declined over the last couple of years. Again, I should say, decline a couple of years ago. It's now trending upwards. So, but there was a big drop because of COVID. The second part, the budget development part, is what we're going to spend most of the time on, talk about like really looking at what makes up our budget, what is the structure of it, why do the conversations seem to sort of hinge on tuition, property taxes, and compensation and nothing else. And I'll sort of explain the whys, but then open some doors for things that we can talk about or take a look at in more detail this year. And again, that's going to open the door because we want the board's feedback on what information do you want to hear from us to help go into the budget development section. We're now early on in the year. We don't have a lot of performance so far this year that's that useful, but we have realistic projections for what next year's budget's going to look like. Now we have plenty of time to develop reports, have extra study sessions to talk about specific things as we develop the budget this upcoming year. Okay, quick and dirty about talking revenues in the first place. So I put this slide together. It's intentionally grayed out in the areas that are, so this is all funds, this is the total budget put together, and then the sources of funds that are used to pay for the college's all funds budget. The left side, you can see a big chunk of it, not quite half, but getting close to that, is either fund balance, that's using college reserves, college savings, if you will, to use, to put into the budget for one-time purposes. Primarily, that's for investing in the capital, the centers of excellence projects. Grants and contracts are things where the money comes in for very specific purposes and the expenditures are tied directly to the revenues that come in. Think the biggest one of those is financial aid. Financial aid comes into the college. Say we get $40 million of financial aid comes to the college, it goes directly to students. It's not something that we have any extra money to do anything with. So that's why I grayed out that. So those two sections, while they're big parts of the budget in their total in terms of revenues, they're not significant in terms of what kind of discretionary things we can do with those funds. The other thing that I did, and I haven't done this before, is point out a couple of things, which is one, this one you've seen before, which is investment income, other incomes, very small in the grand scheme of things. Then you get to what ultimately goes, why do we refer to it sometimes as what had been a three-legged stool, now a two-legged stool, which is that you can see here, property tax levy is the majority revenue source for that supports our operations, and then tuition and fees is the next largest. These two little slices here, we added in to sort of give some context. So while we have these conversations about tuition increases and whether we increase property tax levies, those little slices are what those conversations are all about. They're not about the big parts. They're about these little ads. But those little ads are really important to cover the additional expenses that happen in a given year. So I don't want to say they're not important, but when you look at the grand scheme of things, they're they're very small pieces of the big picture. Then you can see state operations and other revenue. think of those two things, the primary revenue sources for those. The other revenue for Prop 301, it gets coded as other revenue. For Prop 207, and I might be saying it the inverse way, it's counted as state operating aid. It's a quirk in the way the accounting works, but if you put those two together, the primary sources are not state appropriations. State appropriations are about $2 million right now. The primary revenue sources coming in from state sources are from Prop 301 and from Prop 207. 207 is the Smart and Safe Arizona, the marijuana-based money. Okay. It's really important to understand with those different revenue sources what the factors are underlying them, what kind of things that we can do that have an effect on them. And the answer is we don't have a whole lot of effect on much of the revenues, which is why we end up going back to property tax and tuition as the big drivers. Looking at property taxes, the way that those grow, they're not based on enrollment. So we could double in size and the property tax would essentially have the same limitations it has right now. Tuition and fees is based on what is fairly obvious. It's based on the amount we charge for tuition and the number of students we have. That said, there's one important caveat to it, which is that as we grow as an institution, if you grow significantly, you have to add enrollments. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute, because you don't just get additional revenue for students, you get a little bit of additional revenue for additional students, because for every number of students, and again, I'll show you how that looks at the next slide, that if you add a class to support those additional students, that then comes with an additional new cost to it. So the net is not as big as just an increase in tuition. State aid, while these are related to enrollment, the property tax money that comes in, not property tax, but the 207 and 301 money that come in are allocated based on enrollment. But it's only based on enrollment in the sense that community colleges get this much of a pie, and then your share of the community, our share of the community college is allocated by what our enrollment is. So if all of the colleges doubled in size, and the tax revenue from 207 and 301 stayed the same, if everybody doubled, we would get exactly the same amount. So it doesn't grow by the number of enrollments, it grows by only if we grew proportional to the other colleges would we get more money from those sources. So in other words, it doesn't come back in terms of enrollment, it only helps a very, very tiny amount. What's more important is people spend more money. That helps. Yes.
Dr. B, I'm not understanding that. So you're saying that if we increased enrollment, we would not get additional revenues?
If our enrollment increased and all the other colleges in Arizona increased also, the tax-based revenue would just be that our share would be exactly the same. So we wouldn't get additional money. It's not based on as opposed to in the old days, pre-2009. The state aid was based on X dollars per footsie for certain things, so that if you added a student, you would get additional money. That's not the way the tax dollars work. The tax dollars are, you're the college's proportional share of the community colleges. And then, so if the tax dollars are $1 million and we get 10% of it, because we have 10% of the total enrollment, we get $100,000. So if they all double, but the tax revenue is the same, so we're now still 10%, we're still only going to get 10% of those revenues. So in other words, growing doesn't help us in very many ways. It doesn't help us in property taxes. It doesn't really help in those other state revenue sources. It only helps in tuition, and then that, again, as I'll show you in a second, helps a little bit, but not a lot. Investment income is based on how many reserves we have and how we're investing those, and then primarily the driver there is interest rates. Yay, good news for everybody. Interest rates just went down. except for it's not good for the college. It means that our returns that we'll get are going to go down a little bit, yes.
Dr. B, thank you. Do you have an approximate of what our proportion of those state dollars is as the other? You
It's a little bit
10%.
higher than the 10%. I was using 10% just to be easy, but it's about 13, I think, 12, 13%.
But if we did grow in proportion, we grew and the other colleges did not, we would see an
Yes.
increase. Okay.
A little bit, but again, because of the proportions, it still wouldn't be a lot. It would take a huge amount of growth proportional to the others before it would be a really noticeable increase in revenues. But yes, you're right. Mathematically, you're right. But for it to be impactful, it would have to be really big. Grants and contracts we talked about, those would be great. You get more grants. It allows you to do new things, but they usually have very specific purposes and expenditures tied to them. So they don't net the college, only in the sense that if you get a little bit of operating overhead for certain federal grants, that helps. So it is good to get grants. It does help a little bit, but again, it's really on the margins that it helps. And then, as I mentioned already, fund balance is really, you only want to use it very specifically for one-time investments. And then we have the board policy that's related to that to sort of make sure that we keep that at a healthy level.
So Dave, and maybe you're going to get to it in a second, and maybe actually it is right here. So tell me if you just want to present this slide, but I just sort of what I'm extrapolating from what you were just saying is the sort of caution, and tell me if what I'm saying is right. The caution around increasing enrollment is that the tuition that those students are paying for every new student we come in doesn't cover the cost to the college. So when we're adding students, we have to add other revenues beyond just their tuition in order to continue to support their education, because we don't cover the cost of educating them solely based on tuition.
That's not exactly what I'm saying, but generally speaking, yeah. So the reason I'm saying it's not exactly, because that makes it seem like I would be discouraging enrollment growth. Enrollment growth, we need to grow in enrollment, and it does help. My point is more like it doesn't help so much that it suddenly becomes this huge chunk of money that the college then has at its disposal to spend in any way possible. It won't work that way.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, like, so tomorrow our enrollment doubled, like whatever. I mean, that doesn't mean that we then automatically, just based on those new students' tuition, have the money to cover the cost of their education. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. There would need to be other money.
We would be able to cover the costs up to a certain point, but as soon as you started having to invest in additional resources to support those students, so the direct, and this is, I'll do this and then we'll come back to you, I think, because then it'll get to your question a little bit. It doesn't answer it completely, but gets to it. So when you look at adding, if you add students and they go into previously existing classes, so you fill a vacant seat in a class, that's a gain of revenue. That works to a degree, but as soon as you start growing substantively, you have to start adding classes. When you add classes, that's when you marginally just gain a little bit of money. And then, so if you look at this, and this, what this represents is plus 20 enrollments, that's essentially 20 people in a class. And so they would take 60 credits, that represents 2 footsie. So if you think, what's a footsie? Like, it's always a weird concept, right? A footsie in terms of a class. You generally have 2 footsie in a class. With our tuition charge, you would generate $6,000 of tuition. So in the case that I was just talking about, if those 20 students came in and they filled seats in previously existing classes, you gain $6,000. If you have to add a class, however, to cover those 20 students, the adjunct faculty, the direct expense that's related to that, direct, right? So this is the cost that you immediately obviously have related to that would be about $3,500. So you would net $2,900. Again, it's positive, so you want it to happen, but it doesn't gain that much. Where you gain is the efficiency angle. If you can add the students and you're not adding the sections, it actually is a big gain. And that's what we would like to do. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to strategies that we want to look at. What I did on the right-hand side here is really trying to show, okay, we had pretty good enrollment growth this last year. This is about what it is, roughly. It's about 500 footsie gain. Assuming that those are all paying students, so they're not all in dual enrollment, but the 500 is about what it was like exclusive of dual enrollment. So there would be additional tuition revenue of an amount that would be noticeable, 1.5 million. However, adding the classes, the sections related to those additional students would also come with a pretty significant price tag. So the net gain is about $600,000. Doesn't solve the college's financial problems. Helps, doesn't solve. And so that's the challenge of adding enrollments. It helps, but it doesn't solve, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So the adjunct faculty cost, how's that calculated?
So that is essentially what their per load rate is. So there's 3 loads. This is the most typical type of class. It's a 3 credit class and a 3 load class. The per load rate is $1,000 per load. That's the lowest amount. We have 2 rates. There's 1,000 and 1,050 are the 2 rates that adjuncts are paid. So it's based on the lowest rate and then plus fringe benefits related to that. So which is mostly taxes and some minor benefit related costs, workers' compensation, things like that.
And would that look different if we had to increase the number of faculty in aviation?
If you were able to find adjunct faculty, it would look like this. If you were having to add a regular faculty, you're now negative. So when you add in regular faculty to cover these new enrollments, that's when you go negative.
Thank you.
When I was looking at the math, did you use the tier 2 adjunct?
I used tier 1.
You used tier 1. So the extra money above that $1,000 is the fringe benefits?
Yes.
Okay.
Payroll tax. When I say fringe benefits, it includes any benefit. Adjunct faculty aren't entitled to much in terms of benefits. That also includes payroll taxes and things like that you have to pay. Okay, so here's what the revenue picture looks like when we took this is a very typical thing that we talked to the board about early on in the budget development. What do the projections look like in the upcoming year? So if we increase $1 in tuition, again, this is just for the context, increase $1 of credit per credit for tuition, that would generate another $400,000. So again, not a lot, but again, it is important. It adds up. If we don't increase property taxes at all, and we go what's called levy neutral, that's just assuming the growth in new property, that would be an additional, we can expect it'll be about $2 million, roughly. So we'll get another $2 million without having to do anything. If we increase by 2%, that adds another $3 million. And then if we go all the way to the maximum amount that we can possibly go to, that adds another 1.5 above that $3 million. In state aid, we're not expecting to get anything else. I don't think that there's anything, any indicators at the state at this point that would indicate that appropriations would come for our operating purposes. We're always pitching for that. We're always going in with Maricopa, and the other colleges make the pitch on a pretty, I think, every year to try and restore state funding. With the state budget outlook, I think it's unlikely that it will happen this year, but of course we'll keep pitching for it and we'll keep trying to get that, but I wouldn't think that it's likely to happen. And then going down to the other revenues, this last year, other revenues did help our budget to the tune of over $1 million. We cannot expect that's going to be the case in the upcoming year. We do think that we might get a little bit more money in 301 from sales tax revenues. Investment revenues, as I mentioned, the factors for that are going down. So I think flat would be the best we could hope for with investment returns and what our budget expectation would be in that. And then Smart and Safe Arizona seems like it's flattening out in terms of what the sales volume is. So we're probably going to get about the same next year. So when you take that, sorry for the ringing, I think getting closer is probably better. If you take that outlook, let's do real quick. We'll do some of the expenditures and what they look like. Going down to number 3, what we start with is always looking at like continuing operations as they currently are. That doesn't mean we don't make changes. It just means that by and large, the majority of what we do this year is going to happen next year. We do tinker, we do change, we do reduce expenditures in different areas, that sort of thing. We do add things in certain areas where we have growth areas, but by and large, the majority of what we do is going to be the same year over year. What that often means is the contractual obligations that you have are flat to going up. They often go up if enrollment goes up. Some of our contractual obligations are tied to enrollment, so licenses for IT equipment, for example, go up. Utilities typically go up, and we have measures in place. I'll talk about that in a minute, things that we're doing to reduce costs or flatten them out as much as possible. We have things in place for that. But in normal, typical years, contractual obligations go up about $500,000, even when you're trying to hold them flat. I think we're hopeful we can probably keep them more closer to flat in the upcoming year, but that takes a lot of work. Now moving on to employee compensation, the sustaining the class comp structure, we think about a year of experience, as we've talked about, costs the college an additional $2.5 million to $3 million. That's without giving minimum increases to people, which is something that we've been doing because there's a good reason to do minimum increases. But if you just say, what is the bare minimum? A year of experience is about $2.5 to $3 million. In the benefits side, typically, the costs for medical benefits for employees go up $500,000 a year, sometimes as much as $1 million a year. That's pretty typical. So at this point, it's pretty early in the game to know what that's going to look like, but we always think in the terms of $500 to $1 million. So if you take those basic things that I just said, the very bare minimum things, it's pretty reasonable to conclude that expenses will be going up at least $4 million. Revenues are going up too. That's why we always have the conversation we have. Now, then what do we do? So what are the strategies we have in place? So let's talk a little bit more detail about the expenses. What are the big expense drivers? As we've been talking about, we are doing things to reduce expenses to try and generate revenues in other areas. What does that look like? So these slides, left-hand slide shows all funds budget. And this is shown in a direct expense, so it shows really what is actually happening from an expense standpoint. So the largest portion is the general fund operations. That's our typical operations. You can see the capital and restricted. That's the same thing that I've been talking about a couple of times. These are the one-time type things or the very restricted specific purpose things. So we'll just ignore. The idea is let's kind of carve those things out. Not talk that much about. That's why we're always talking about the general fund. We're talking about the operations. So on the operations side, it's important to show debt service. That actually will improve this year. So the primary driver of that is revenue bonds. That's around $4 million a year until those are paid off. I think we're in like year 4 of 20, so we're getting there, but we have a long ways to go. The other part of that is operational leases for computing equipment, and that will gradually over the course of the next 3 years go away. So it's about $3 million of improvement. So it will reduce the expense about $300,000 this year because we won't have that ongoing expense. That's the reason I wanted to show that little slice of that pie. Okay, so when we're looking at, this is now the general fund budget, as we have talked about, the large majority of it is personnel expenses. That's very typical of higher education. We're not unique. We're actually not bad. There are lots of colleges that are worse than us in terms of a bigger proportion are personnel. But when you talk about where would substantive expense decreases come from, that's why we often end up going to the personnel side. Then operating is about a quarter, and then we have reserves and contingencies. What those things are is they're undefined, how they will be used, or they're set aside in case some unforeseen need pops up. So the board has a contingency, a reserve for $3 million in case of some emergent situation. It has never been used and shouldn't likely ever be used, but we budget for it in the case that we may need to have some flexibility there. Okay, this is the same slide with a little more detail. So this breaks out now the personnel gets broken out into the different categories. So administrative expenses, faculty, adjunct faculty, staff, classified staff. So that's non-exempt and exempt staff. This is like temporary wages here, and then the fringe benefits. One of the things to also keep in mind that we talked about with the budget, one of the goals with the budget was to reduce the personnel expenses by about $2.5 million a year. So we've made pretty good progress to date. We've closed about, I think it's about 9 positions. Total is in the administrative area, it's a reduction of about $500,000. So this amount is actually about $500,000 less now. And then in the staff side, it's another reduction of about $300,000. These are closed positions that we have taken off the books. And benefits are about $300,000. So it's about $1.1 million that we've closed so far. So we're making good progress. We need to make a concerted effort, and we're going to be talking with ELT to come up with some strategies to identify and close positions along with what the guidelines or what our targets are going forward. But again, we've made pretty good progress so far, and we'll continue to do that throughout the year. One of the things on the benefits side,
Dr. B, what's the ratio of of our administration and staff costs per student?
So if you think our students are, it's about 11,500, and if you combine those costs, it's $73 million divided by, you just say divided by 12, that's six. So 6.
We don't need you to do that right now. Just
Well, you can
get it for us.
Yeah, you can
Yes,
get that
for
for
sure.
us. And then I'd like you to make a comparison between what we're paying now, what the ratio is now, as opposed to 5 years and 10 years ago.
Oh yeah, it'll be high for sure. Yeah.
Dr. B, can you talk about the reserve contingency expense there, the 12.4, and how that's deployed or what we use that for?
So that is the thing that I was talking about. So reserves are things that are undefined. So sometimes they would be things like a strategic initiatives fund. So it hasn't been defined exactly when it's being budgeted. It hasn't been defined on how it's going to be used. So it's set aside. Each of the executives have discretionary reserves of some sort. That's a smallish proportion. And then I mentioned the $3 million at the board. So the $3 million of that is a contingency specific to if there's an unforeseen issue. Then there's a handful of things that are reserves like strategic initiatives, which is not insignificant. That's like around $2 million. And then the other piece to that is there are reserves that are set aside for enrollment growth. So that is to say, if we got 3,000 more footsie, the economy tanks, people come to the college, our enrollment booms. What did I say would happen? We would have to add sections, right? We have to have the ability to spend the money. So we budget for reserves on the case that if enrollment grows, we would then have the capacity to spend the money. So the money would come in from tuition. The expense, though, needs to be set aside. We have to have the ability to spend it. So between those like 4 things, that's a majority of what I just talked about. But I'd be happy to give more detail to you and the board about that.
And then one more thing that I would like to know is, maybe the board does, but how much of our expenditures are we using for attorney fees?
We definitely can get that to you. In fact, actually, that you're getting a little bit ahead of me, but I'll show you where that would show up, and because I think that's one of the doors that I wanted to open to provide the board with more information. Okay, so we've talked about personnel quite a bit. We know what the issues are. Staffing is very high. That's why we're trying to reduce staffing over time. And as Board Member Garcia pointed out, anything that you do in comparison, any expense we do in comparison to enrollment over time will look bad because enrollment has gone down so much. And because a lot of those expenses, particularly on the staff side, administrative side has actually been held flat mostly over the period of time. Flat, went down a little bit and then is pretty flat. Staff expenses have gone up, particularly because of class comp and the fact that we haven't reduced many positions. So if you think the expense has gone up because of class comp and enrollment went down a lot, you'll see where the issue is. And that's why we've been looking to reduce staff through attrition over time. Okay, this is all in orange, not because it was a mistake. That's actually intentional. So this is the previous slide's orange pie, orange slice of pie, only now made as a whole so that you can see within operating expenses, where are the expenses? What are the expenses within operating expenses? That quarter of the whole total, what is that? As you can see here, about half of that is contractual services. And I put chargebacks in there. Chargebacks are actually a negative because that's an internal transfer within the college. But a lot of those expenses are offsetting things that are contractual. So I put it in there. I labeled it not to confuse you, but just in case anyone was trying to tie back to the numbers so they could see what I was doing. So you can see communications utilities, about $5 million. Pointing out one of the things that we talked about at the last board meeting is trying to do what we can to reduce energy consumption is going to help this. So when we're talking about reducing the expected expenses for utilities, that's working to reduce that. We're also looking to reduce the cost for cell phones within the college's cell phones, small dollars in the grand scheme of things, but it's looking at what can we do to change how we're operating that will reduce some of these expenses. As you can see, about a half of it is contractual services. And this is where I'm going to open the door and say, it seems to me that the board might be interested in seeing where does that go? What is that made up of? Because I'm often just saying, well, these are things like custodial expenses and IT licenses. There's not a lot you can do with it. However, I think it would be a good conversation where we actually went through and you saw what those things are that comprise them. Just for today's purposes, because I didn't want to just throw that and say we'll talk about it later, about a third of it is IT, about a third is facilities, and about a third is everything else. And everything else includes marketing expenses, insurance. Those are two of the big others. And then it would be other legal expenses, although that will be a fairly small part. But I'm picking up that the board would be interested in getting more information related to the contractual services and the budgets and what they pay for. Okay, I think I'm getting close to the end. See if there are the couple things. On the benefits side, going back to this slide, to reduce benefits expenses, there are three things that you can do. None of them are attractive. One is you have fewer employees. That helps. So when I was talking about the savings we've had so far related to reducing those positions, adding in the reduced benefits costs, that's one way. Another way is you split and you have the employees take a bigger share of the employee premiums for the benefits. The other one is you cut down how generous the benefits plans are. Happy to have that conversation with you. I will tell you that we are hiring a firm. It's a small dollar thing, relatively speaking, so you wouldn't see it in the board packet, to get an idea of how does our health benefits program compare to other institutions. So we're getting an independent study so that we can kind of get that information. Generally speaking, our benefits, the perception that I have, and I think it will bear out with this, is that it's not the best plan, but it's closer to the better end of the spectrum in terms of how much employees have to pay and how robust those medical plans are. I think it's one of the things that makes us an attractive employer. But we're looking to get more feedback, and we'll share that information with the board as well so that you guys have a good idea of where does our plan fit compared to other institutions, other organizations. Okay, also, that point, I said all three of those are not particularly desirable. Obviously, reducing your size when you're overstaffed is the least painful, but those others, when you're shifting costs to employees, we have absorbed increases to our benefit costs for years, trying not to do that, what I think is fairly duplicitous, where you increase the medical costs that employees have to pay for, and then you give them a small payroll increase, and the net is like really nothing, and then you pretend like you gave them an increase when you kind of didn't. So we've avoided that. That is something that lots of institutions, lots of organizations, private entities have done that over time, increasing the premium share, putting more of the burden on the employee. But it's a conversation, right? It's something that we should talk about. All right, ongoing strategies. These, I've talked about these as we were going, and then I'm going to just kick it off and have you guys give whatever feedback you'd like. A couple of things that we've highlighted. We are working on reducing positions. We're going to get more aggressive with doing that. Again, it's all through attrition at this point, so it's looking at vacant positions and looking at how to be more efficient. I do have one really good example of how, if you're working smart, you can do this. There was a position in athletics where the position did a lot of coordination of athlete travel. And there's a person on the finance side in the business services travel unit who also was facilitating a lot of that. The one person in athletics left. That was primarily what that person did. The person who's in finance has now moved over to athletics and supporting athletics directly. And basically, by doing that and recognizing that the right person is working and can do probably a little bit more than the two of them were doing, we're actually able to reduce a position. So that's actually really nice because that's across units. It's a lot easier to do reorganizations within a unit where you shrink things within a unit, but there are examples now happening where people are looking to go, how can we do this a little differently and reduce our staffing size across units? That's what we need to get better at as a college. And then I mentioned we are actively looking at all of our licenses. Do we use them, these IT licenses? Are we using those systems? We have duplication of systems, trying to cut down as much as we can the costs related to that. We've talked about the energy efficiency and some realizing through more efficient equipment and systems that we will reduce some of the costs over time. And then the last one is one that you'll hear more about going forward, and you've heard a little bit about really looking at what assets we probably don't need anymore and really thinking about how we can either lease out space or offload those assets for sale, that sort of thing, and cut down some of our handling costs that we have associated with that. I'm going to be deliberately vague on that, some of the things that we're working on. But some of the space at district office we've mentioned, I've talked about with the group, and we're getting closer and closer on shrinking down some of the space we have here. All right, I think that does it for what I wanted to make sure I touched on. We're a little bit past 6. I did put in what the timeline is. This is the sort of typical timeline for when the key items happen. I suspect that the board may be interested in a couple more study sessions in the fall. I'm totally open. I already have picked up that talking about contractual services, some of the metrics related to enrollment and personnel costs. There's a little bit of that information provided for you also on a routine basis. Yes.
Dr. B, I think as a community college, I know that the board has discussed it before, but we really need to look at trying to get state funding. We absolutely, now whether the voucher system has millions of dollars that they haven't used, our whole educational system here in the state of Arizona leaves a lot to be desired. And so I don't know if you can put, we can work to get it on a ballot as a petition to try to increase our funding, but definitely we cannot continue to have the taxpayer pay into this, and I don't want to see us reduce any of the healthcare benefits for the staff or the faculty members. As it is, they're not paying an inadequate salary to begin with. So that's my take. So I think maybe we need to look at these other options.
I just have a couple of comments. I think, Greg, when we were talking about the tuition, how, maybe enrollment increasing doesn't really help. I just want to remind everybody that the data that was on there, 5,000 students take a 3-unit class, and the net gain was $622,500. Whereas when we raised the tuition $1 for all of our students, for all of their units, that was a $400,000 increase. So I don't want any of us to think that really striving to increase enrollment, there are added expenses. Dr. B nailed it right on. There's classrooms and everything else. But I do think that the numbers show that there is a benefit, a financial benefit to increasing enrollment. So that's my first comment. Second thing is, we would like to talk about differential salaries. There are all sorts of programs at the college where we cannot hire qualified instructors because why would anybody want to do a job for, 60, 70% of what they could get in the real, outside of education? But I also think that when we talk about that, we need to also look at how we talk about compensating our employees, because when we look at compensating all employees as a negative thing, it's a fight, it's a battle, all of those things, we might not be looking at the possibilities in the best sense. And I'm going to agree with Maria. I think that we need to continually strive to pay our employees a great salary. I know you and I have already talked about this, but we always used to hear, well, we were the second payer, and the reason we were the second payer is because we were $1 more than the third payer. And what I would like to do is let's take pride in it. Let's be the second payer, but let's pay $1 less than the top payer. I would like to maybe not get those exact numbers, but let's strive for that. I think there will be a little bit of discomfort amongst all of our employees when, I find out that somebody else with my same, what we're doing at the college is getting paid a lot more than me. So we need to be sensitive to employees, but we also need to make sure that all employees feel like we value them and we show them that through their compensation packages. So thanks for doing that for us.
Yeah, two things that you made me think of that I think, again, I'm here to open doors. The conversation about getting some metrics so that you can see how we pay compared to other institutions. I think we'll work on putting something together so you can see that. I think at this point, I think we will look quite favorable as a payer compared with a few job exceptions. We know of a handful of jobs where it is hard to fill them. That's why we're calling them hard to fill. But on a whole, the way that the class comp structure works leans us more towards paying, because it's all about ensuring that we're paying people fairly. And some of our colleagues probably don't follow the same goals that we have. So we can, we'll put together some metrics that will show some of that to get a good idea. The only one I think that would fit into that same category is adjunct faculty, where we do consistently look to measure against the peer institutions. And we're number 3 behind Maricopa and Coconino, both higher cost of living locations. They have particular, Coconino has particular challenges getting qualified faculty up there, but we're close to them, and we're closer to them than the bottom of the tier, but we'll provide that information as well so you can see sort of where we fit, both with adjunct faculty and with a number of our other positions where we can do those comparisons. The other one I think that we should probably have conversations about is differential tuition. And looking at high cost programs, because one of the only ways that we can probably expand some of our high cost programs is if you did the math, and I said just the math is not with a high paid faculty, just a regular faculty on that incremental marginal model that I just showed, and I said you're already negative. You're negative with the lowest paid regular faculty, not a differentially higher paid faculty position. It's even worse. And those are programs, when you expand those programs, the equipment expenses and other things associated with it, it's hard to expand those high cost programs when you're sort of at the edge of where we're at without coming up with some other revenue stream, like how to do it. So we can have a conversation about looking at differential tuition and different ways to approach that. That would be probably later in the fall, because there's some analysis. That's a little bit more complicated analysis to go through, maybe even early, like January-ish, just to set the expectations. It's a little bit harder. We're working on it, but I just don't know how soon we can get that together.
And I just do have one more question. And somewhere on one of your pie charts, I saw a 1 million, or the one, it's on, I guess, page 8. Scholarships are 1% of that general fund by category. So is the foundation's finances, so what does that mean, 1% scholarships?
So the college does have a small number. By small, 1% is still not a small thing. It's over $1 million of institutional scholarships. So there are things, athletics is one, but there are also other, I think they're typically need-based programs and merit-based programs. They used to call them the Chancellor's Scholarship. I don't know if they still have that name, but there's a small number that financial aid has discretionary scholarships that they award. And it's technically coming out of the general fund because it's so, and one of the things that actually is a topic that we talked about. I know a few of you were here for this conversation. You can increase tuition and then increase the scholarship. So we actually did increase the scholarship amount some time ago. So then if the idea is, well, we're worried about what an increase in tuition would cost for the people who can least afford it, well, you can increase the tuition cost and add more scholarships, right? So you're not gaining the full amount, but what you're doing is you're enabling yourself to give scholarships to the neediest students, and then presumably the students who can afford it more can afford it. It's a concept. We don't do it much. It's a much bigger issue that happens at other institutions, but we did it a little bit a number of years ago. That's not where it predates that for those other scholarships that I was mentioning, but we did add a little bit to it a few years ago.
This is kind of a follow-up question on, I think, something that I believe Chancellor Nassi and I had talked about that we're working on. So back to that idea of cost, like the part that concerns me, and I am 100% behind growing our enrollment, is the cost of educating the student is not just the cost of the adjunct faculty or the faculty member. It also shares a piece of all the staff, all the administrators, all the technology. So when you look at the actual cost, when we add enrollment, it costs us money when we add, we bring in some money, but if tuition and fees covered all of it, we wouldn't have to charge property taxes at all. We would just live solely out. So when we talk about the financial reality and the cost per student, I would love to know what that number actually is, by the way, like when you take in all of it, like the entirety of the cost for what it costs us to educate a student, again, all of their portion of staff, administrators, IT, licenses, all of these things, air conditioning, that's all the cost of what it takes to educate a student. So we know that number because I don't know what that number is, but I think what it does, and again, I'm 100% behind growing enrollment, but it goes back to what Maria had said about how important some of those additional revenues are, like the state dollars that we bring in, because if we all work our tails off to increase enrollment, it's not going to solve our financial problems. Like we're still going to have the same, just the numbers are different because growing our enrollment solely does not get us out of the financial situation. We have to have either fewer expenses or more revenue. And so, yeah, I'm 100% behind being as aggressive as we can, A, to grow enrollment, but B, to return to a place. But I would love to know what that true cost is, because I think from maybe even from like a marketing perspective, to be able to compare ourselves to the U of A or whoever else in terms of what efficiency we might have, I think that's an important number because there's more behind it.
So I'm just pulling up, I'm not going to get into the details or walk you through this, but just showing that at the back of the presentation, there are the links to some of the metrics that we have. There's a couple of different places on the finance webpage. There are metrics that show the average cost and how it's changed over time. I thought that I included it, but we cut it and then just put it in a link. It's about $20,000 per student. If you take all of our expenses and divide it by FTSE, it's about $20,000 per student. However, a lot of that, why it's important to talk about it differently. If we get a FTSE and they walk in the door, they don't cost us $20,000 because we can absorb that student without doing anything. It's en masse, that's why I'm sort of talking about the direct expenses that are related to that person walking in the door are more like the adjunct faculty. But as that grows, it grows toward that number, right? That at a certain point you have to add a student services person, at a certain point you have to add additional electricity and water for the consumption that happens, et cetera, et cetera. So eventually it goes to that point. The $20,000 is really high right now, though, because the infrastructure, as we've talked about, is built for a larger institution than 11,500. I mean, we were at 23,000 at one point. Now that wasn't healthy either, but I think the infrastructure here could probably handle 17 pretty well without having to add a lot.
So just real quick, when Phil Burdick and I went up and spoke with Warren Peterson, President of the Senate, he asked us what that ratio was. And I mean, it's just basic math, right? I'm agreeing with Dr. B. The basic numbers aren't going to change when we add 5,000 students, right? And when you divide that big number by X plus 5,000, that ratio is going to be lower. And what correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, but what I think Warren Peterson was saying was, hey, you guys are spending a lot of money per kid. Why do you already need ours? So that's one other reason, if that enrollment number goes up, we're dividing by a greater number of students, that ratio is going to go down. If we can compare, well, our bang for the buck this is our ratio per student, and this is the ratio for the universities, right? And if our number is a lot less, you should be supporting. Right. And I think that straightforward math would be beneficial for our state legislators to understand.
And there's the chart that I was referencing where you can see how it's grown. Now that the way that this chart is calculated, it does show the investment, the additional investment in the Center of Excellence, so that this isn't just purely operational. So it's growing steeper because of that investment, but you can get the gist of it, right? It's very high and has been growing. And even if you took out capital from this, it would have grown significantly over the last number of years. Again, combination. Expenses have gone up and enrollment has gone down. Compound each other, right?
Since I've been on the board 2 years, I feel like I've increased my knowledge a little bit as time went on. And I'd like to know that none of these comments I'm about to make have anything to do with you, because you run a very efficient budget. And the 2 years I have coming in makes me a little more comfortable with making big decisions on budgets. However, Dr. Barraza will be way ahead of me, so her questions will be much more difficult than mine. We've been told as a board that our responsibility is to delegate the operations to the chancellor. And that's what we think we have done. And I don't see it as the board's responsibility to cut the budget. I see it as a responsibility of the chancellor coming to us with a budget with significant suggestions on how we should change things. So I'm going to ramble just a little bit here. I think there's a few things we need to think about as we move forward on this budget. And one thing that we don't talk about well, the most significant thing you did say tonight, I'm going to paraphrase you, Dr. B, is we're using the same model this year as last year and next year. And that's what we've seen since we came on the board. $2.5 million for this, $4.5 million to that. The $2 tuition is going to increase this. Property tax $1 is going to increase this. And that's what I have heard for the last 2 years. I think we ought to interject some other kinds of conversations, such as when we increase the tuition by $3 for a student, what is the value added to his experience? What does he get for that extra $3 in tuition? And I don't think we've ever had that conversation, at least to my satisfaction. We talk about faculty and staff increases. We talk about new programs and those kinds of things. But to tell the rank and file student, this is what you're going to get for an extra $500 or whatever it is, I don't think we've done that. And in the same regard, I don't think we've done that to the taxpayer. To tell the taxpayer, we're going to increase your tax to $75 a year. And by the way, this is what Pima College does for you. And we expect you to fund us, which we have to do. And you're going to get this as a benefit to the community. so that I feel better when I pay my tax bill. I think some of the conversations we have been mostly generated around increasing revenue through tuition and taxes. But I also think we're to have some very difficult decisions, recommendations coming from you, Dr. Nasi, about programs that don't carry their load. And that would be such things as dual enrollment. The K-12 system is paying basically for the dual enrollment. We give credit to those students, and we have staff working in the dual enrollment area. In fact, that's our biggest ding on the HLC. So what have we done in the last 5 years in regards to dual enrollment that, number one, would cause the student to have to pay for the credit that we give them for free? And that to me would be a revenue source. And I would see it maybe to saying to you, you're going to get high school credit for taking that AP English class. And although, oh, by the way, if you want Pima College credit, you got to pay $50 of credit for that. And let them make that decision, other than us just voluntarily making a donation to that student. And the other things that we have to look at, I think, and it was mentioned before, is differentiated tuition. We're losing money on aviation and nursing, certainly. And what are we going to do about that? That conversation needs to happen among staff and say, this is what this costs, this is what we're charging, and they need to kick in a little bit more money. Or at least be upfront and say, the kids that are in English 101 are going to pay more in tuition so that we can have more nurses. I mean, to me, that's the kind of conversation that needs to happen. I have a whole bunch. So I'll leave it at that. And before I leave, I'll give you this in writing. So some more thoughts about the budget, the revenue, and I think we need to be more creative with our lobbyists and maybe who they interact with. And instead of just going to the legislature and saying, we need our footsie back, we need our state aid back, maybe we have to make some suggestions such as, well, we now need the opportunity to go to our voters and ask for a budget override like K-12 does. And if they support us, we get more money and it goes on their property tax, whether it's primary or secondary. But we have no other opportunity from the legislature to increase our revenue, so maybe we come up with a creative way of doing that. I don't know in other states if they have those opportunities, but K-12 does. So I think there's lots of conversations we haven't had in the last 2 years that need to happen quickly. And Dr. Barraza will take care of the rest of that. Thank you, David.
Mm-hmm.
I just have a question. I mean, is there anything else that you need or want from us in terms of what we're thinking on particular things or where we are that would help you as you're going forward with?
No, I will add a couple things that Dr. Nasi and I have had some conversations. We'll be having more conversations with the leadership team about sort of forming a few different ways to really, again, get more and more efficient, some things that are related to classroom scheduling. That would be another conversation about what the expectations are in terms of how many students are in a class, how well we hit those targets, that sort of thing, what we can do. Because if you do it and you do it in a large scale, it will have a significant effect. So there are things on that side. I mentioned the things about better use of our assets and figuring out what assets we don't need to have and trying to figure out the best way to reduce those unnecessary assets. And then the personnel side. So those are the three primary things that we're looking at this year that will help. All of them will help and can help pretty significantly. Obviously, external revenues, any additional revenue sources. The challenge with the state, I think, is there are a couple of, I think, ideas that are, it would be really nice if they came together. The challenge is that the state budget is not very good, so the outlook is not positive. However, there's an election in November and the seats can flip and suddenly the priorities could change, and that might change things in a way that we could see fairly, something significant pretty quickly. I wouldn't bank on it because, again, the budget is the budget up there. I mean, the reality is what they would then decide if the legislature flipped you might see that education started becoming a bigger priority than something else, and maybe some additional funding could come in. It's plausible, and we would see that fairly early. I think we'll see signs of that fairly early on if that happens. And then lobbying and doing different things it's just the community colleges are an afterthought for this state, unfortunately.
Well, everybody in education thinks they're an afterthought because they are.
Well, that is right. I think you could start with saying education is an afterthought here. Then you could say within that afterthought, we are the third of the three tiers, sadly.
Thank you. And as Dr. B mentioned, right, this was an early study session. And so one thing I want to do is make sure that we're here early and often talking about where the budget stands. It is something that we're thinking about. David, if you could just, and thank you, I've been spending a lot of time with Dr. B and working, and when I first came to the college and I saw our level of state funding, I about fell out of my chair. Nevertheless, at just a basic level, slide 3 is our budgeted revenues, and so just on average, we're looking at around $375 million in revenues for our fiscal year 25. For expenses, as we go down to whatever slide that is, there's a couple of pie charts there. Between operating and personnel, I'm coming up with around 280. I mean, how do I reconcile just the baseline level of budgeted expense versus revenue?
So it's primarily around the two things where I said take the equity that's for one-time investments, put it off to the side.
Okay, so
take
that's the $80 million.
The grants and the federal stuff and kind of put it off to the side.
Sure.
Then you start talking about the stuff that's really the true discretionary stuff that we're talking about, the true operations of the college. So that would be it's a simple reconciliation, but that's basically it.
And one of the things that was on the slide that I'm interested in is the actuals, the budgeted versus actuals. And of course, there's lots and lots of what I would call cost centers at the college, probably hundreds upon hundreds of those. But historically, as someone has looked at those, what does that look like at the end of the year? Are there, I know certainly I've worked in departments in my career where we were budgeted 1,000, we only spent 500. What does that process look like? Is there a sweep at the end?
Yeah, no one keeps their money at the end of the year. So operationally, they're swept. In the designated fund, there are places where some reserves could be maintained. So designated is a subset of the general fund. And then in capital, if the project is ongoing and crosses the year, the money would carry forward, but they have to go through a process to get justification to do that. But a normal budget, when you're talking about an operation budget, a department budget, at the end of the year, it's all whatever you didn't spend wasn't spent, doesn't carry over to the next year.
Any sense of what that looks like in aggregate? I know it varies year to year.
Operationally,
I won't hold you to it, but
I'm trying to look at so personnel, we tend to save $5 to $7 million because of vacancies. Right now, the more we cut that, the less we'll have that savings. But vacancies that aren't filled, $5 to $7 million is like less than 10%. But the turnover is like 5% here. So, and you figure it takes time to fill. So it's like a decent amount of money that isn't spent. And we budget for the full position, but we also we plan for some of that to not get spent. On the operating side, it's probably about 90%. So typically we underspend our budgets. Now, what's really important about that is let me give it in a real simple terms. So if budgets typically get spent to 90%, you can sweep that. You can sweep the budget and you say, well, this year you spent $90. This year you had a budget for $100 and you spent $90. Next year we're going to make your budget $90. We've been doing that, by the way, but I'm saying next year's budget is $90. Now, what would a savings is if they spent 90% of the $90, so now they're spending $81. And that kind of happens, But if they go and they say, well, I have a budget of $90 and now I spent $90, now they spent 100% of their budget and they spent exactly the same amount. So the actual expenses year over year are what matter. The budget is a capacity document. The actual expenses is the thing that really matters. So I gave you, I think, kind of what you're getting at is that we tend to underspend our budgets. The budgets are deliberately meant to be a little bit high in case things, unforeseen things happen. But when you look at our expenses, we've got to be judicious about how we're actually spending money.
Yeah. I think it is a conversation around expense. You know, certainly the funding and the legislative strategy is certainly a part of the conversation long term. But in the immediate, I do think there's, right, we can think.
And there's
And
opportunity.
we've started to, right? to
There's,
think-
and
to
we've
think
made
about expense.
progress, and there's opportunity to make more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. B. Okay, thank you, everybody, for being here. We're going to adjourn this meeting.